Okay, folks, we want to thank you for tuning in tonight to our Mountain Zoom series. Phil had other commitments, so he wasn't able to be with us tonight. But we're glad to still see that the Virginia folks are represented on here. We have with us tonight, is it Dr. Jonathan Larson, I believe?
Yeah, technically, yeah.
Yeah, technically. Dr. Jonathan Larson, he is an entomologist with the University of Kentucky. And he's been with us, I think, is about 4 years now?
It'll be my second anniversary come August, yeah.
All right, well, we've had a lot of programming with you, so it just feels like it's been longer.
Yeah, I can see that. I have that effect on people.
Obviously, he's a great conversationalist, so I'll just hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the invite. I think I spoke to this group early in the pandemic, so it's kind of interesting to be circling back around and talking to some of the same groups, and I appreciate the invite. I get to talk tonight about one of my favorite things, actually. It's interesting when I get invited to talk about bugs. I am usually asked how to identify it and how to kill it. Those are the two most common questions that I get. And so I appreciate any opportunity that I get to do a talk like this, where I actually get to talk about the bountiful benefits of insects and talk about some of the things that they can do that are actually a net help to us as humanity. So we're going to talk about some different kinds of beneficial organisms here tonight, some different groups that we sort of cluster them into, and then also talk about some specific benefits that we get from these critters. I think this is an important topic, honestly. And I say that as an entomologist. I'm aware that I'm an oddity. I'm one of the few people seemingly that's excited about the cicadas coming out of the ground here soon. And I've had lots of people sort of chastising me for being so millions of bugs boil out of the ground. But it's important that we kind of dispel some of that, I think, because when we talk about insects, we're talking about the largest group of animals that exists on our planet. There are more than 1 million species of insects that we've already identified. There's the potential that there's 30 million more left to discover. That's an insane amount of biodiversity. It's a huge group. It's almost unfathomable. When you look at this screen here, this image from, I think from the Smithsonian Museum, these are just some beetles that are pretty closely related. There's only a couple of different families, or a few different families, that are represented here. And you can see that there's just this immense amount of differential in size, in function, in color, in form. It's just an amazing group of organisms. The ways that they've been able to fill all of these niches on our planet and just take advantage of all these different nooks and crannies that nature offers. And while I think it's amazing, I know that for a lot of people, when they think of insects or they think of bugs, they really think of the word pest first and foremost. Pest has almost become synonymous with insect. It's almost the same thing in some people's vocabulary. When we talk about pests, I'm not here tonight to tell you that there are no bad bugs. There are lots of pests out there, and we'll talk about some of that here in a moment. But you also have to remember that when we're identifying pests, this is by definition something that impacts only us. A pest isn't a natural thing, really. A pest is defined by an adversarial relationship with us as humanity. So these are destructive insects or any other animals that attack things like our crops. We have a spotted cucumber beetle here, can cause a lot of damage, even transmit some pathogens from plants to plants. We have things that attack our food that's in our home. Sometimes you'll open up a cereal box, maybe you haven't opened it in a little while, and you'll see, hey, there are caterpillars in here eating my cereal and pooping all over what's left. You can go outside. If you have livestock, you'll find that there are flies and ticks and all kinds of things that are trying to feed on those. We have things that attack literally our home, our structures. Think about carpenter ants and termites, or some of them that just get into the house and annoy us. The carpet beetle there on the right, also known sometimes as the warehouse beetle. These are little larvae that live down in the fibers of your carpet. They eat all the skin and hair that sloughs off your body throughout the day. And then they develop and turn into those adult beetles in the middle there. Outside, they would eat pollen, but in the home, they're feeding on bits of us. They don't really cause a lot of issues, but they are annoying. Some people just don't like seeing them. So we have to contend with that. And then think about things that do attack our bodies. Think about bed bugs and lice and mosquitoes, things that have plagued us for millennia and transmit pathogens to one human to another and just annoy the heck out of us and steal our blood. These sneaky little blood thieves going around in nature. And so I'm not here to tell you that these things don't exist, but we have to remember that they comprise only a small portion of that overall population of insects. When we break it down by the numbers, only about 1% of insect life would fall into what we consider a serious pest category. And my serious pests representative here on my slide is the Japanese beetle. I think you would all agree with me that that is a serious pest. It's a pest as an adult and as a larva. As an adult, they feed on over 350 different species of plants. As immatures, as grubs, they're down in the soil feeding on the roots of our turf grass that we grow for lawns and sports fields. They cost billions of dollars in damage. They're super annoying. I'm guessing some of you are gardeners and you probably hate this insect with a fiery passion because they ruin your plants, they ruin your roses. They're not a lot of fun to have around. That's a serious pest. Another 3% of insect life I would call minor pests. And that is represented on my chart here by the green June beetle, another scarab beetle closely related to the Japanese beetle. They are pests occasionally of overripened fruit, pests occasionally of turf grass. They have really large grubs that actually can kind of burrow through the soil, similar to a mole. And when they do that, it can uproot the turf. But by and large, they're kept in check by things that we're going to talk about tonight, natural enemies, things that eat them, things that lay their eggs in them. And we only have outbreak years occasionally of them. So they fall into that minor pest category. That leaves, after those two groups, the other 96% of insect life kind of unaccounted for. And I would argue that when we look at that group, there are a lot of beneficials in there. But we also have to remember that they're not just our bug friends. There are a lot of those out there. There are some that are neutral, though. We have insects that just exist. They're just out there. They just live on our planet. They're just animals. They don't benefit us one way or the other. They don't harm us either. But we are going to talk about some of those beneficial ones too tonight, those ones that actually do help us in some way that we can point to for some sort of benefit. These neutral ones, though, I hope that people will keep that in mind. If you think about animals and you think about the planet and you think about us as in our relationship to it, I think that humans tend to have a very human-centered view on things, which makes sense. I mean, that we want to kind of sort of enhance our species and protect ourselves. But my daughter's upstairs moving chairs around, so if you hear that, I apologize. But it's hard for me to just think about us, I guess. And when we do that, we forget that there are a lot of things that are just on the planet that they're just there. They don't hurt us. They don't help us. Think about insects like the stonefly on the left there. It's not really anything that confronts people. I mean, I'm not staying awake at night thinking about stoneflies. I'm going to guess that most of you aren't either. Maybe if you're a fly fisherman, you have some experience with them. But by and large, they're just a cog in the great machine that is nature. Same for ground beetles, like we have on the right there. Ground beetles, they can sometimes get in your house. Sometimes they eat weed seeds. Sometimes they eat pests. But by and large, they're just kind of here. They just want to pass on their genetics to the next generation. We don't really have to worry about them one way or the other. If you wanted to get about it in a very philosophical way, I would say that that's great. That's beautiful. They're a part of the complex environmental systems that we love, that we need. And without them, who knows what would happen? But we don't really profit from it necessarily. On the other hand, we do have some insects that we can point to and say, okay, now this is a bug that provides a tangible good to us or an economic service of some sort. Some of the ones that make tangible goods I like to point to, one is the silkworm. Silkworms are the creatures that create the luxurious silken threads that we use to make tablecloths and fancy underpants and all those different kinds of things. That comes from a caterpillar. You can see what happens in the upper left-hand corner there. The caterpillar spins this silken cocoon around it. Inside is the pupa. That's that big brown thing that you see there. And the ancient Chinese figured out that you could take this, boil it, pull the pupa out and unspool all of that thread, and you could use those fibers to create the silken luxury items that we enjoy. It was their private secret for a long, long time until some people snuck in and smuggled out silkworms and mulberries, because these insects particularly like to feed on mulberry leaves. And then the secret of silk was kind of broken out into the world, and other people started making competing businesses. So silkworms provide a tangible good. I would also point to the ones that make economic services, like the pollinators. Pollinators, you can get goods from them, of course. If you are a honeybee keeper, you get honey, you get beeswax, you get propolis, you get royal jelly. But also we have to point to the fact that they visit all of these different fruiting crops that we enjoy consuming. And without them, we couldn't have things like squash or apples or blueberries. And we enjoy all those things. So they are providing free labor to farmers by moving that pollen around. And you may have seen some photos online if you are interested in pollinators, showing places where pollinator populations are so low that folks are out there hand pollinating their plants. They have little paintbrushes going from apple tree to apple tree trying to help produce the fruit that they want to sell. And there's billions of dollars wrapped up in the success of those insects because the success of the farmer is sort of dependent upon them. So we do have beneficial ones, and we're going to cover some of the different kinds here tonight. Broadly speaking, we break them up into these three groups. The first one we'll talk about are natural enemies. I'm going to spend most of my time on the natural enemies because it's a group that's full of carnage. Look at that horrific picture up there. I mean, that mantis is just like a vampire. It's ripped into that grasshopper's neck, and it's just going to town. It's going to eat as much of it as it possibly can. And they're very photogenic. They're very weird. It's a very captivating and charismatic group. I would say in terms of popularity, though, the pollinators are definitely number one. When we think about beneficial insects, people tend to think of honeybees first and foremost, but others might think of things like this Buckeye butterfly, a thing of beauty, a thing of utility and helping to move pollen around in some plants. We also have to put other things in that category like flies and bees, and we'll talk more about that. A group I'm going to shortchange a little bit tonight will be the decomposers. The decomposers, the smelliest of the beneficial organisms, to have no doubt. They are the ones that help us to break down sort of decomposing matter. They are the ones that feed on the bodies of carrion, and they help to break down things like roadkill. Others, like this dung beetle that you see in the lower left-hand corner, lay their eggs in balls of dung that they create, helping to break down all of that fecal material and return the nutrients to the earth. It's an important group, but one that often doesn't get its due. So we have to remember that they're out there. It's just not something that I had enough time to spend with here tonight. So it's an interesting sort of menagerie that we have out there. There's lots of these beneficial organisms, and we're going to try and go through a few of them here tonight, starting with the natural enemies. So to break natural enemies down in this group, we have two main categories. So two more boxes to put things into. We have the predators, and then we have the parasitoids. A predator, you've probably heard this term many times in your life. This is an organism, an animal that attacks and kills multiple prey items over the course of a longer life, usually, and they consume those multiple prey items completely, usually. Predators are kind of one or maybe two or three steps up from primary consumers, which are the herbivores, most often the pests that we think of in an insect world. So if we think about predators, usually we think about big mammalian things like the tiger on the left there. But in the arthropod world, we could also think about things like this large tarantula, other things that attack and kill multiple prey items throughout their life, helping to naturally suppress populations of things. Their friends in this natural enemy group would be the parasitoids. Parasitoids are organisms that are attached to or live inside of an individual host that eventually they will kill. So each individual parasitoid is really only responsible for taking down one pest organism. Now, that may sound like less of an ideal situation, but there's so many parasitoids out there that we actually get a lot of suppression from these. So things in this group include flies and wasps. If you look on the left there, those are some on the left there, those are some fly maggots that have developed inside of a caterpillar. On the right are some wasp larvae that have developed inside of that baby beetle. And they've consumed these things from the inside out. And this is very different from parasite. Parasitoid and parasite, they sound very similar. Parasites are things like tapeworms. They want you to live as long as possible. A tapeworm does not want to kill you if it doesn't have to, because it's meal ticket. They survive as long as you survive. Parasitoids have no such qualms. Parasitoids always consume and kill their host, and then they pupate and they turn into the adult form, which is usually a pollinator after that, actually. But in this immature stage, they're very beneficial for killing lots of different pest organisms. These natural enemies are essential pieces of the food webs that surround all of us. We used to learn about food chains in biology class. Nowadays, we tend to call it more of a food web because things are much more complicated than just a simple linked chain. It tends to look more messy, like what we see here. All of these different things consuming each other not in a vacuum, just in a big area. So the one on the left there, we've got some black-eyed Susans. There's aphids and grasshoppers and caterpillars on them. The aphids may be killed and eaten by a lady beetle, which is in turn possibly eaten by a bird. That bird could be eaten by an owl, or it could be fed on by a mosquito. The mosquito is eaten by things like the dragonfly. The dragonfly in turn could be eaten by a bird or a mouse. You can see how this can get very complicated, having all of these different interactions out there. So we like having them there. It's helpful to us to have. Yes? Oh, I thought I heard somebody say my name. It's helpful to us to have these out there as part of the natural ecosystem to attack and consume different things that we don't want to have around. Without them, there really is no balance. When we see things get perturbated in nature, it often results in things like natural enemies being destroyed in a local ecosystem. And once that happens, things get out of whack really quickly. Without their natural suppression of different pest populations, we can see things start to fall apart, like we see with this house of cards that this gentleman has constructed. So once you start pulling these things out, once you start pulling these individuals out, you can lose a lot of the power of them, and then the whole thing sort of falls apart. It starts to get out of whack on you. And there's a couple of different things that we can actually point to and say, okay, this is an example of this. This is a way that this works when we lose natural enemies. One of the problems we see is something called pest resurgence. And pest resurgence happens when we harm natural enemy populations. So let's say you have a rose bush. You look at the rose bush and on it there are aphids. The aphids are being consumed by lady beetles, but you really don't want the aphids there. Maybe this is a rose you're trying to grow for a fair. Maybe it's something that you just really hate aphids, you really hate pests on your plants. And so you want to get rid of them, regardless of the fact that lady beetles are feeding on them. So you go through, you spray an insecticide, it kills all the aphids that are present. It has the side effect of also killing all of the lady beetles. There's usually some cross contamination there and the lady beetles are killed. Now we have a vacuum. Now we have this rose plant with nothing living on it. Nature abhors a vacuum. And the first thing that's going to recolonize on there is going to be aphids, because there's probably a lot of aphids in the environment around the rose bush. Natural enemies like the lady beetles, they take a lot longer to rebound from this kind of event. They don't come back immediately. And so now this aphid is on this plant, the insecticide residues start to fade. There's nothing there to eat them, but lots of food for them to consume. And so they start mating or they start reproducing with abandon. And now you have this huge surge in the pest problem that you originally controlled with the insecticide, because there's nothing there to help suppress them naturally. Also, in this category, we could have things like secondary pest problems. A secondary pest is something that's normally curbed by natural enemies, but is then released when we remove other pests that the secondary pest was competing with, and then also the natural enemies that had been suppressing the secondary pest. So my example here is a birch tree. On your birch tree, you might have some aphids feeding on it. And then come June or July, Japanese beetles show up in mass. They start feeding on the leaves. And you say, oh my goodness, I have to do something about this. This is a new tree. It's relatively young in the landscape. So you go through and treat all the leaves with a pyrethroid. And it stops the Japanese beetles for a couple of weeks. But it doesn't really work on the aphids. You don't really kill too many of them, but you don't mind because they weren't really a problem to begin with. But now there's nothing stopping them. There's nothing competing with them. There's nothing consuming them. So they start to reproduce. And now you have this surge and a pest that you hadn't even been thinking about in the beginning. So we do have these issues pop up once we start getting involved. And we usually call this the pesticide treadmill. This is where now you are going to have to keep treating, because if you don't, there's nothing else to help you. There's nothing else to stop these pests. So those are some of the reasons that we want to keep natural enemies around and that we want to protect things like these lady beetles that I've been alluding to. So lady beetles are extremely important organisms. They're important predators of a lot of different kinds of pests, including aphids and scales and mealybugs. These are all sort of squishy, sap-feeding organisms that end up on a lot of our different ornamental plants, our trees, and even some of our crops. So we love to have these lady beetles come through and feed on them. And the reason we like them is because they're predaceous as a larva and as an adult. So they're feeding throughout their entire life. There are some estimates that each individual lady beetle is responsible for consuming something in the neighborhood of 5,000 aphids over the course of their life. When they are developing, they go through complete metamorphosis. And this is important to highlight because not everybody usually recognizes adult lady beetles. They tend to know what those are, but not everybody recognizes a larval lady beetle. Complete metamorphosis means that they look very different from their larval stage to their adult stage. So in this diagram on the right, you can see the eggs, kind of a yellowy color, kind of an elongated oval. These will hatch into larvae. This graph, I need to fix it. So I need to take new pictures and fix this because I don't know who made it, but you can see it goes eggs to larva rather, or it should go eggs to larva rather than eggs to pupa. But eggs hatch out larva. The larva will feed and develop. They'll eventually pupate. The pupa tends to look like a bird dropping on the side of the plant. And from that pupa will emerge the adult, which will then continue to consume things like aphids. That's what it's doing in this picture here. It's eating this aphid, starting at the rear end and going forward. Lady beetles are pretty impressive organisms because of the way that they eat. They're also very impressive when they overwinter. They tend to overwinter as adults. They do this in large aggregations. They're able to find one another because of a pheromone that they create as a group. That pheromone is called an aggregation pheromone, and it sort of says, hey, party's over here. This is the best hot spot for the winter, and they all can smell it, and they'll gather together under logs, under rocks, on cliff faces, places where they can get some sun, get some warm, and stay alive throughout the winter. And then they'll start the whole process over in the summer. The other thing that's interesting about this group is the way that they're colored. So most species of lady beetles exhibit what we call warning coloration. The scientific term is aposematism. And this warning coloration is a mixture of a bright color contrasted with a dark color. For this group, it tends to be reds, blacks, and whites mixed together. The reason that they have this is it's the opposite of camouflage. Camouflage, you want to blend in, you don't want to get eaten, so you hide. This is a way of saying, hey, I'm over here. If you mess with me, you're going to get the horns, kid. You don't want to mess with a lady beetle. And part of the reason you don't want to mess with them is because of this activity they have where they reflexively bleed. A lady beetle can kind of bend their knees, and out from their knees will come a foul-smelling and bitter liquid. It is essentially their blood. If you taste it, and I have because I'm a weird scientist, right? It's very bitter. It doesn't taste very nice. If you consume enough of it, it will make you vomit. And the reason that that's important is because if this happens to a bird or a mouse or anything that eats these lady beetles, eventually they're going to associate this coloring, this red and black pattern, these dots, with getting sick or with a nasty taste. And so they don't eat any more lady beetles. A few of them will have to die to sort of establish that mindset. But after that, they're not getting fed on by things because things know that boldly colored organism tastes really bad and will make me puke like a freshman on a college campus. So just some examples of lady beetles that you could encounter here in Kentucky or in Virginia if you're tuning in from over there. We have quite a few species in this group. One of them that I like to point out is the 7-spotted lady beetle. I bet you can never guess how it got its name. If you look at the back of it, you can see that it has 7 bold black dots. Entomologists are not a creative lot when we name things. If it's got 7 spots and it's a ladybug, 7-spotted lady beetle, bada bing, bada boom. If you look on the right there, you can see its immature form. It is almost, I'd say, alligator-like in appearance. It has that kind of dimpled alligator-like skin. They tend to be very black in color with small orangey colored dots on them. But that is also consuming aphids. It's a beneficial organism. I'm often brought these immatures and people see them in an area with damage and they assume that this is the culprit, but really they missed all the aphids and scales that were actually causing the problems. The 7-spotted lady beetle has those 7 dots. They're kind of full-bodied in appearance, very big dome on their back. Typically, this is larger than the other lady beetle species we'll talk about, including the pink lady beetle. The pink lady beetle, as you can see on the right there, has a more pinkish color hue. They're also known as the spotted or 12-spotted ladybug. Again, if you count up those spots, you'll notice that there are 12 of them. Their immature form has less black, has more of a pinkish orange coloration on it, This is a native ladybug. It's one that we like to see. It's been around in the US for a long time. That's a little different than some of the other species we'll talk about, like the multicolored Asian lady beetle. These feed on aphids. They also eat caterpillar eggs, pest caterpillar eggs. So kind of a double up on some pests there for you. Then we have the convergent lady beetle. This is identified by the convergent lines on the thorax. If you look on the top of the thorax there, you'll see these two dashes, these two sort of lines going across the back there. Those, if they kept going, they would converge. That's how they get their name. I kind of wish that somebody else had named it and they had named it the angry eyebrow ladybug or something like that. I think it looks like a very angry face on top of their thorax there. This group can be a little confusing because they can be red, they can be orange, they can have 12 spots, or they can have no spots at all, but they always have those lines to help us identify them. Final one I'll mention is the Asian lady beetle, also known as the Asian multicolored lady beetle, sometimes also referred to as the Halloween or Halloween lady beetle. This is a species that is invasive. It was brought here on purpose some time ago as a biological control experiment. It was released into the United States in the hopes that it would control pests like the soybean aphid. This was before we had some of the stricter controls that we have on these kinds of projects. And so these scientists released it. They looked around, they didn't see any at the end of the season, and the aphids were gone. They were like, that was good. It can't survive here. It eats the bugs, then it dies, it freezes to death. And then they said, okay, let's do it again next summer. So they brought some more over, same result. And they said, okay, we're going to do this on a big scale. This is important. This is going to be a very successful experiment for us. Then they got a phone call from a state that was a few 100 miles away, maybe even 1,000 miles away. And they asked these initial project leaders if they had been working with this lady beetle species. And they said, yes. Why? And they said, oh, well, we found some up here. So unfortunately, they had escaped. We think they actually traveled up the Mississippi River, and they ended up in many different states. And now they kind of plague us every year. If you've interacted with this lady beetle, it's probably been in your attic or in your home or in the coverings of your lights in your home, because they like to get into the house over winter. And sometimes they stain things. If you're a grape grower or if you're a wine producer, these can be a problem. They actually will fly into grape patches and they crawl in amongst the grapes, and then they get processed with the grapes. And remember, I mentioned that bitter blood that these insects have. Imagine a bunch of that getting into your wine vat and then tainting all of your wine that you're producing. It's not a very good tasting flavor for a bottle of Cabaret or whatever. I'm not a wine drinker, but about a bottle of, what's the wine? A Pinot Noir. It would not be a good addition to the flavor profile of that wine. This group can be identified by their kind of orangey coloration. They can have big spots, little spots, no spots. They can have a darker brick orange coloration, but they always have an M on the top of their thorax here. If you look at all these different ones, you can see this M right there. Here's another M on this one. M right here. That stands for multicolored Asian lady beetle, which I think is pretty handy of them to have that stamped on their back. Other beneficial natural enemies include the mantids. Mantids are part of a group that we call Mantodea. They're their own order of insects. They're that unique. There are over 2,400 species of them on Earth. Typically a large insect with a green coloration. They usually have a triangular head and then these raptorial legs that they use to snare their prey. They're quite famous for them. You can see them on the front of each of these individuals. You can see what they're used for. So mantids generally look like this. Some of them are brown. Some of them are more ornate, like this orchid mantis. If you want to blend in with a purple orchid, you're going to need to be kind of a purpley pink color yourself. And you may have some ornamentation to help you blend in with the ornamentation of the orchid. So by and large, just a really fascinating group. They catch a lot of different things. This picture on the left is pretty famous on the internet. This mantid has caught, quote unquote, caught a hummingbird. This has been recorded as happening. There is a lot of controversy around this. Some believe that this photograph is staged, that the person killed the hummingbird and handed it to the mantid. It seems to be kind of holding on for dear life. But other people claim that they have witnessed them actually do this activity, that they hang out on the hummingbird feeder and attack the hummingbirds if they can get their hands on them. I've seen videos of them biting snakes. This one's eating a lizard on the right there, but usually they're using these predatory abilities that they have to capture and kill insects. Mantids are something that have long held humanity's attention. I would argue there is something very otherworldly about them. When you look at the faces of these critters, I mean, it looks like an alien, right? It looks just sort of like our popular conception of the little gray or green men that wander around in outer space. You can even find on a lot of mantids that we experience this phenomenon called a pseudopupil. A pseudopupil on the left there is an insect's eye is very complex. So every eye is made up of thousands of little lenses, very different from ours. Each of our eyes has one lens. It takes those two pictures in our brain and we push them together. That's how we get our vision. For insects, they get thousands of images put together in a collage. But when we look down that lens, and if we look down the eye of the insect, the light doesn't come back properly at us and it's absorbed, and you'll see this black dot appear in their eye to our vision. And this is called a pseudopupil. It doesn't actually have a pupil. If you walk around, the pupil will follow you because your perception is moving. What you're looking down into is moving. It's not that the pupil is following you, but it can be very convincing that they're watching you, just like those paintings in the Scooby-Doo cartoons, that they have their eye on you and that pupil is following you. People in ancient cultures loved these things. They kept them as pets. They assigned them a lot of supernatural powers. I've read about in ancient Greece that it was a common perception that if you got lost on the road, if you were walking somewhere and you didn't know where you were going anymore, it would be good to have a mantis with you or to find one because they could show you the way home. I would really like to know the success rate on that. I've not seen that data, but it was this thing that they thought they were wise, they were smart, and they could help you find your home. These go through incomplete metamorphosis. So kind of a contrast to the lady beetles that we talked about before. These start as an egg. The egg hatches into a nymph. The nymph hatches, or the nymphs develop into the baby praying mantis that we can see here. It looks a lot like the adult, except small and lacks wings, and they just gradually get bigger and develop their wings till they reach adulthood. The last time I tried this video, unfortunately, it had been taken down, and I can't find a good replacement for it. It was of a dude that had raised up these egg cases. They're called oothecas, if you look here in the upper left-hand corner. Inside of there are thousands of eggs, and I'm pretty sure in the video he is he's high on something. He's high on marijuana or something to that effect, and it's hatching in front of him and he's losing his mind. He can't believe how many of them are coming out. It is really interesting to watch as they kind of extract themselves from the eggs. They don't look much like a mantis, but they'll slowly spread their legs out and start to get ready to develop. When they initially come out, they're pretty weak and small, so they can catch little flies, things like fungus gnats or fruit flies, but they also eat each other quite a bit. There's a lot of cannibalism in the early stages. Other important beneficial predators that are out there include the lacewings. Lacewings have these very slender bodies like you see here. Their bodies look almost like a dragonfly's. Their head looks like a beetle's head, but then they have these wings that look very lacy, and that's how they get their name. There are two different kinds that we have here in Kentucky, the green lacewing and the brown lacewing. Again, I bet you can guess how they got their names. The immature form is also a predator. So the adults eat some things, but the immatures are also beneficial. It's this organism that you see on the right there. They're called aphid lions. And if you look, I can definitely see how they got their name. I think they look more like a saber-toothed tiger with these big sickles in the front of their face. But they're going around eating scale insects. They eat aphids. They have an interesting way of laying their eggs when they're adults. The female will create this big silk strand, and then at the tip, she puts her eggs. And the hope here is that they won't eat each other. They have to crawl down after they hatch, but they can't really crawl back up. And so they can't get up there and eat all of their siblings, luckily. It's kind of a survival strategy for the species. They'll eat just about anything. They like aphids, they like caterpillars. They'll also get mealybugs. You can see them taking down large caterpillars there on the left, eating small aphids there on the right. This is something that naturally occurs. We usually don't have to introduce these. They're just something that finds our pest populations and attacks them. I think the final predator that I'll talk about tonight is the ant. Ants are pretty famous. They're the #1 predator in the insect world. There's lots of different species of ants, of course, carpenter ants, pavement ants, odorous house ants, fire ants, if you go to certain states. But they all tend to exhibit pretty similar behavior. They have a queen. The queen has lots of female workers, and those workers go out and hunt in packs, and they take down really large prey items, things that are usually quite a bit bigger than them, like this weevil on the left there. I've seen them can attack and take down a big earthworm. They're pretty good at what they do. They're kind of like the raptors in Jurassic Park, and they do a lot of this. They need a lot of food for the colony. They have to feed the queen. They have to feed all of the individual workers. They have to feed the baby ants, the male ants that may be in the colony as well. So there's a lot of food needs. They reduce a lot of different kinds of pests too. One example are some turf pests like sod webworms. They eat sod webworm eggs. They eat about 75% of them that are laid. So that's 3/4 of the population that's already been killed by these ants, and we don't have to worry about. They also attack grubs. If you don't want grubs in your lawn, having ants around can help. They lower grub populations by around 20 to 25%. The ants attack the eggs and consume them. They also attack and kill the young grubs. Here we see a first instar white grub. So it's not very big to us, but it is pretty large to these ants. But working in concert, they will use their mouth parts, these powerful mandibles that they have. And some of them even have stingers. And they'll take this thing down, cut it up Benihana style, and take those grub steaks back to the nest and feed it to everybody. It's a really impressive way of going about finding food. Other examples, they eat black cutworm caterpillars. Cutworms can be big pests in greenhouses and high tunnels. They can be a pest in the field and in gardens. If you don't like having them around, ants will eat about 62% of the young black cutworm caterpillars that are out there. After we have the predators, we can talk about parasitoids. These are wasps and flies that lay their eggs in or on other insects. We have a smattering of examples here. We have a broconid wasp in the upper left that's stinging and laying its eggs inside this aphid. This is a wasp that's attacking a mole cricket and doing a similar activity. Down here is a tachinid fly that has emerged from its pupa, and the shriveled up thing next to its brown football looking pupa is its former host that it has destroyed. The parasitoid way of developing is a lot like the movie Alien. You have a parasitoid that lays its eggs in a host. The eggs develop inside the host and then burst from it and chew their way out, developing into the adult form. If you've seen the movie, you know that the people on the spaceship have eggs laid in them, and eventually these big aliens pop out of them. It's pretty horrific. It's pretty fascinating too. And it's something that happens naturally and is very helpful to us. Some good examples in this group, I would point to things like the tachinid flies. These are true flies. Some folks like myself call them the hairy butt flies. You can see why in these two images. They have these big spiky hairs that show up on the rear end of their abdomen, and it kind of separates them from things like the housefly or carrion flies that are out there. These are similar in shape and coloration to houseflies, but those bristles kind of help to separate them. You can see that, I think, in these two images. Their immature maggots are inside of different things like caterpillars, sometimes even earthworms. They are also pests of earwigs, so they'll attack earwigs and take them down for us. So here's how it kind of goes. If you look, there's this caterpillar in the upper right. It's got eggs on the outside of its body. Here's another image on the left. Those eggs will hatch. The maggots that pop out of the eggs will bore into the caterpillar, and then they will feed on it from the inside out. And then they will pupate. Usually to do that, they pop out of the thing that they've been developing in. Other times they pupate when it pupates. If you look in the lower right there, those are maggots that are inside of the pupa of a hornworm caterpillar, and they've completely demolished it. That thing isn't going to develop. Here is a short GIF showing what happens. So those are maggots that were developing inside of this caterpillar. They have finished, and you can see with this time lapse that once they're done, they're going to wriggle their way out, and they're going to crawl off and pupate and turn into adults and start the whole process over again. So it's pretty horrific if you get down to it and you're a caterpillar. I hope none of you have a pet caterpillar that's watching. We also have wasps. There's a group called the typhid wasp, which parasitize white grubs and other scarab larvae that may be appearing in the soil around your home. So here we have a white grub. It's this organism right here. And then attached to it, sucking it dry, is this wasp larva that has been feeding on it, slowly sucking all of its innards out. And now that wasp is going to pupate and turn into an adult. There's an insect called the Typhia vernalis wasp. Doesn't have a common name, unfortunately, but they attack Japanese beetle grubs specifically. The adult female, which you see in this image in the upper left-hand corner, she flies above the turf grass and she can smell the fecal material of Japanese beetle grubs. And when she detects it, she drops down to the soil. She starts digging. She lays her eggs on the white grub. It hatches. And then as you see, it slowly gets bigger and bigger and sucks the life out of the grub. Just a little vampire, if I can have an homage to another sci-fi character or fantasy character here tonight. Another group would be the Burconid wasp. These are much smaller than the Typhia vernalis wasp that we were just talking about. They look sort of like another group called the ichneumons. They have this long tail, but they're much smaller than the ichneummonid wasps. But they tend to stick to caterpillars. They lay their eggs inside of them. And then we see these pupa that look like vases that pop out of the back of the caterpillar. A very famous example of this are the Burconid wasps that attack the tomato hornworm. This hornworm has been feeding on a plant, but now it's full of wasp larvae. If you see one that looks like this, don't kill it. It's not going to feed anymore. Its life has been ruined. But if you kill it, you may kill the wasps that are sticking in out of the back there, and you'll lose out on all the benefits of having those parasitoids. So leave these ones be. You can kill the other ones if you like, but these ones have the wasps in them, which will help to suppress populations in the future. These wasps also attack aphids in some instances. So they lay their eggs in the aphid. As the larva develops inside, it causes the aphid to kind of puff up and to take on this papery appearance. With that papery appearance, we call this a Burconid wasp mummy or aphid mummy. And the adult will chew its way out. They create this circular hole in the back of the aphid and then escape from their little portal that they've made. But those aphids have been destroyed. They're no longer going to be a problem for us. Like I said, there are three kinds of beneficial organisms we could talk about. I left the decomposers out because I also wanted to talk a little bit about pollinators. It was the one group that I was specifically requested to kind of reference. And so the reason we want to talk about pollinators is because of this net benefit that they provide for agriculture. Pollinators provide about $29 billion worth of services for industries like the apple industry, almond growers, blueberry growers, folks who grow macadamia nuts and tomatoes, all these different delicious things you buy in the produce section at your local store, we couldn't have without the success of pollinators. That's a big number. I don't think anybody from the Bill and Melinda Gates is on the foundation is on the call tonight, or the Buffetts or anybody. So I also like to point out local pollination services are important too. You can't have your backyard garden without these. You can't get a successful pumpkin harvest or tomato harvest without them. You wouldn't be able to have your ornamental flower beds without them. Flowers wouldn't exist without these organisms. So it does happen on a small scale as well. And because of that, we really want to conserve this particular group. When we talk about pollinators, I'm guessing the first insect that popped into your head was the honeybee. There's a good reason for that. Honeybees are extremely important for agriculture. They're basically domesticated livestock at this point. We've been keeping bees for thousands of years. You can go to Egypt and you can see clay tablets that describe their beekeeping secrets. They used to keep their bees in clay tubes that they constructed. If this diagram is to be believed, honeybees used to be about the size of a house cat as well, but they used to keep them in these tubes. This is a little different than the boxes that we keep them in now. But the Egyptians were the ones that figured out how to smoke bees. So when you are a beekeeper, if you want to get into your hive, you'll have a smoker that produces plumes of smoke that'll calm the hive down. But when we look in the past, the Egyptians were the ones that kind of figured this out. And they did it because in their mind and their religion, the bees came from the sun god Ra. And Ra, he cried golden tears and they turned into honeybees. And in order to honor Ra or Re, depending on how you pronounce it, they would burn incense for the bees as an offering to their deity. And they thought they were sort of pacifying him and he would calm the bees down. But really what it was is that it has this effect on bees that we still use today. These organisms are not native to our continent. Honeybees did not exist here prior to the colonial expansion of European powers onto this continent. So we actually brought them with us on things like the Mayflower and other ships that crossed the ocean, which I have to imagine it was daunting for people. Imagine how daunting it must have been for some of those bees to cross the ocean. We released them here. You can actually read some accounts from the past in places actually like Kentucky and Indiana and a few others, where native peoples, they knew that that white people were coming if they started to see honeybees. That was called the white man's fly, because it sort of heralded the appearance of colonial expansion into new territory. So it's a very interesting history here in the US with this insect. At this point, they are relied upon very heavily by many industries. But it is important to point out that they're not the only pollination game in town, even just in bees. There are 4,000 species of wild native bees that make their home in the United States of America. And some of these particular groups of bees, like the bumblebees and the squash bees, I would argue are better overall for our crop production, particularly when you talk about something like the squash bee. A squash bee is just the right size for a squash flower. If you get a honeybee that goes into a squash flower, unfortunately, they can bypass the pollen area and get straight to the nectar. And then they don't get coated in pollen. They don't actually pollinate the crop. They just rob the flower of the sugary juice that attracts the bees. A squash bee can't do that. They're just the right size. They always get coated with pollen. So you can actually lose pollination services with the honeybees being in an area if they're out competing things like the squash bee. This also happens in orchards. You can get the same amount of pollination services that a group of honeybees would provide you with about a fourth of the size of a population of actual native pollinating bees. So you only need 25% of the number of honeybees that you would need to get the same level of service. So it's a pretty fascinating thing, this competition between these two groups. Some of the types of wild native bees that we can encounter include the bumblebees. These are large and hairy bees, bigger than honeybees. They are covered in a thick coating of fur. I think if I were an insect, I'd probably be a bumblebee, big, kind of clumsy looking, very hairy on my face with my beard and my long hair now. These are also social, just like honeybees. They have a queen and workers, but they tend to nest in the ground. They do visit crops. These are used in tomato production for buzz pollination. They pollinate sunflowers. We see them on peppers and a few others. They also pollinate a lot of our wildflowers. You can see a few different species here in the upper left-hand corner. This is the eastern bumblebee, or just the common impatient bumblebee. This one down on the left-hand lower corner is the two-spotted bumblebee because of these two dots of yellow on its back. This is the brown-belted bee up here. It has this sort of orangey brown belt that circles its waist, and then the rest of its abdomen is black. They have that fashion faux pas, brown belt, black pants. And then if we look down here, this is the rusty patched bumblebee. This is one that's a little more endangered here in the United States, unfortunately. We have other types of bees, including the mason bees and leafcutter bees, part of a group called the megachilids. They're named after what they build their nest with. A mason bee constructs clay tubes out of sand and mud that they collect. Leafcutter bees use a sharp set of mandibles to cut leaf discs, and then they fold those leaf discs up sort of origami style, and they put their egg down in there with some pollen in order to develop. They're not social. This is an individual female making her way in the world and taking care of her kids. There is no queen in this situation. They tend to nest down in twigs or in wood holes. If you see those bee hotels for sale in different gardening or retail stores, this is the group that most of those are trying to attract. They're also different than some of the other types of pollinating bees because most bees have very hairy legs and the pollen sticks to their legs. These particular bees, though, their pollen carrying hairs are on the bottom of their stomach. So if you look on both of these images, you can see they have a very hairy tummy. Maybe some of you identify with this. They've got this sort of long patches of hair on their belly that they use to pick up the pollen. Other wild native bees include the sweat bees, part of the group Halictidae. They tend to be more metallic in color, this bright green for the most part in this portion of the country, contrasting with black and gold on the abdomen, or just having this all green body. In other parts of the world, they can be blue. Some of them are a metallic black or even purple. They build their nest in the ground. They get their name as sweat bees because they do like to lick perspiration off of animals, including us. So you could encounter them kind of buzzing around your head, trying to lick up your sweat like a weirdo. But luckily, they're not a sting hazard. They don't have a nest to defend. They don't have a colony to defend. So they don't have very potent venom. I've been stung by these. It feels like a little bubble, a little blister popping on your skin. And then we have the mining bees, also known as the adrenid bees. Pretty small, usually half an inch and smaller. They're black in color, brown in color. They have very hairy legs. They have these short, kind of spiky hairs on parts of their abdomen. They're solitary. Their name implies that they do mine. They dig down into the soil in order to construct their nest. So there are some other kinds of bees out there. I won't go into all of them, but those are some of the highlights that we can encounter here in Kentucky. I do want to point out there are other kinds of pollinating insects, though, and they're not the ones that always come to mind. The flies are actually the second most important group of pollinating insects that we have. They're hairy, they fly around a lot, they need a lot of energy, and so they visit a lot of flowers. Some flies are accidental pollinators. If you look on the left, this fly has been tricked. This plant smells like a dead animal and it looks red like rotting meat. And so this female thought she was going to get to lay her eggs, but instead she's landed on this sticky petal and she's going to get coated in pollen, and she's going to move that pollen around for these smelly plants like the dead horse arum is one of the famous examples. Others are purposeful pollinators. We can see this syrphid fly, also known as a hover fly. This is an insect that mimics a bee in shape and color and sound, and they eat like a bee. So they like a lot of the same plants that the bees do. Here's some other pollinating flies you can find in Kentucky. The tachinid flies that we referenced earlier as parasitoids are also pollinators as adults. This one here in the upper left, this is a bumblebee fly. I think you can see how they get their name. They kind of mimic the appearance of a bumblebee. What about this slender gentleman down here? You might recognize this if you look at it. This is a mosquito. So male mosquitoes are actually pollinating insects. The females are the ones that drink our blood in order to make their eggs and to reproduce. But the males, they're much more vegan. They're kind of a hippie. They are the ones that fly around and they visit flowers and they drink up the nectar and they move some pollen around for us. Of course, the lepidopterans, the moths and butterflies. They're not the greatest at pollinating. They do help with some specific kinds of plants. Moths in particular have really long tongues. And so we see them visit plants that have really long corollas. In some cases, they're the only thing that can feed from that plant. And so we see them have this very special relationship. But when you look at these, they're not very hairy. They don't move a ton of pollen, but they are something that's important. And they're a very charismatic group that people tend to care about. Think of the monarch. This is sort of the poster child for insect conservation. There are others. Beetles can help pollinate. Ants can help in some instances, but those are sort of the heavy hitters, the bees, the flies, and the moths and butterflies. With that, I appreciate your time and attention here tonight. I hope that you got exposed to something kind of weird and wacky in the insect world, learned a little bit about some of the beneficial ones that are out there. Hopefully you'll spend some time this summer trying to look for some of the good ones and find the good in the insect world. And I just appreciate the opportunity to connect over Zoom. So with that, I'll stop sharing. I'll take any questions that anybody may have.
Jonathan, when I was in college, I had a professor named Grant Thomas, who was my soils professor. And he was such an entertaining speaker that I don't know that I missed more than one of his classes just because you went to see what was Grant Thomas going to say next. So I have kept a list of Larsonisms.
I'm honored.
That was tremendously good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to look up Grant Thomas soils.
Great stuff.
Is Dr. Thomas still active?
No, he passed away. I'll sometime off Zoom, I'll have to share some stories from his class that I still remember almost 30 years later.
That's awesome.
Do we have any questions? All right, you've got one. Loved it all. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that.
Chris and Paxton Allgaier, who are on here, are also big entomologists. They're some of Phil's master naturalists.
Oh.
Chris teaches, I think it's math that he teaches over at Mountain Empire.
Okay.
Anyway.
I was guessing that they might like bugs based on the small blue butterfly they have there, Cupido comitas, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're correct. I'm retired now. I'm former math teacher, but still very interested in insects, and I enjoyed this tremendously. Very
Thank
good
you.
job.
I appreciate that. I hope you get to find some butterflies this summer.
Yeah, we found a few good ones just recently, but I wanted to comment on the lady beetle. I've seen them eat the eggs of the potato beetles in my garden.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty cool thing that they do as well. Besides the aphids and mealybugs and things, that was pretty neat. I always go around and grow a whole lot of potatoes, but I go around looking for the eggs and look, try to prevent things. And I turned over a leaf, and there was an adult lady beetle, and she was just mowing down those eggs.
That's awesome. Yeah, Colorado potato beetle is a tough one to control too. So any help that we can get from the natural world will help us to maybe even cut down on some of the pesticide resistance that we see with that bug.
Sure.
Chris, I sent you a photo of an 8-spotted forester moth that I saw, I guess, a week ago. And I saw it and immediately thought of you. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, they are cool. I saw one. I couldn't get a photo of it. I was sitting on my porch last week, and one came in and landed just for a second on a house plant that we had on our porch, and then it flew off before I could get it. But that's a beautiful moth. They're fun to see.
I saw a question in the chat about if minor bees travel in swarms. So it's not that they travel in swarms, but we do see them congregate together in the same habitat. They're all independent of each other. They're all females that are just trying to build their own nest, but they can have trouble finding habitat that they want to build in. They usually like looser soil. Some of them even like kind of the river pebbles that we put in the landscape. Sometimes it mimics the natural thing that they would like. And so we do see them sort of swarm a spot where there's lots of them overlapping with each other. So they're not together. They're not going to defend the area like a honeybee or a yellow jacket would, but they do kind of build on top of each other.
So is this like pea gravel or?
Yeah. They like pea gravel. They like loose soil. They like it to be kind of well drained. They typically want to be on the sides of creeks and stuff like that. But if they can't get there, if they're in an urbanized area, they'll take what they can get.
Any others? Well, I'll give you one last parting compliment, and that is that you are my favorite presenter to listen to. And
that makes my night.
24 years of working in extension, you are the most memorable, most entertaining, and I think as a result, you educate the most.
Thank you. I'm blushing. That
was great. Well, thanks
for having me.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone that tuned in tonight. Do you want to share with us what we've got to look forward to on Thursday?
Yeah, first of all, Jonathan, thanks so much. Glad to have you on tonight. Thanks for coming in. Great information. Yeah, for Thursday night, we're going to switch gears totally. We've had some gardening the last couple of weeks, but we're going to switch totally to a little bit of history. We have Mr. Ron Flannery from there in Wise County, Virginia. Ron is a nationally renowned railroad historian, has huge knowledge on the old Louisville National Railroad as well as the Southern Railway. And he is going to be presenting when all railroads led to Black Mountain. So this is a real good treat to get Ron on. Really looking forward to it. So definitely come back and tune in for that one.
Very good. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you didn't get washed away today. And if it's dry enough, go outside and enjoy the last of the daylight. See you all.
Good night.